Nashville, Tennessee. It was 4 in the morning when Sarah Mitchell pulled her old Honda Civic into the loading dock behind Blackwood Logistics, the engine sputtering the way it always did before it finally caught. She had been driving for this company for 3 years, hauling early morning packages across Davidson County before the sun came up, and in all that time she had never once been late. She couldn't afford to be. Rent was due on the 4th of every month. Her daughter Emma needed new shoes for the school year, and the small apartment they shared on the east side of the city had a leak in the ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix and never did. Sarah was 34 years old, and if you looked at her hands cracked from months of cold mornings and cardboard boxes, you would think she had lived twice that long. She had raised Emma alone since her husband walked out when their daughter was barely 2, leaving nothing behind but unpaid bills and a note that said he wasn't cut out for this. Sarah had cried for exactly 1 night. Then she had gotten up, found a job, and never looked back. Emma was 9 now, a quiet, watchful girl who loved drawing horses in the margins of her homework and asking questions no 9-year-old should have to ask, like why some kids at school had 2 houses and she only had 1, or why her mom always checked the mailbox with a look on her face like she was bracing for bad news. Emma had mild asthma, nothing life-threatening, but enough to mean regular doctor visits and a nebulizer that Sarah kept meticulously clean on the kitchen counter, a small monthly expense that never stopped mattering when every dollar had somewhere else to go. That particular morning started like any other. She clocked in, loaded her van with packages destined for the west side of downtown, and pulled out onto Broadway, just as the streetlights began to flicker off one by one. She liked driving in the early hours. The city was quiet then, honest somehow, before the traffic and the noise and the busyness swallowed it whole. She liked to imagine that somewhere out there things were going to get better. She just didn't know when. She had no idea that morning would change everything. Her route that day was heavier than usual, nearly 40 stops crammed into 6 hours, and by the time she reached her final delivery, the sky had turned the pale gray of early dawn. The address was on the outskirts of Belle Meade, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Nashville, where the houses sat behind iron gates and hedges trimmed into perfect right angles, where the mailboxes alone probably cost more than her car. The package was addressed to a company called Callaway Freight Solutions, care of a private residence, rather than the corporate headquarters downtown, which struck Sarah as unusual, but not unheard of. Executives sometimes had things delivered to their homes rather than wait for office hours. She pulled up the long gravel driveway, parked, and carried the package to the front steps of a colonial-style mansion with white columns and manicured lawns stretching in every direction. She rang the bell. No answer. She rang again. Still nothing. She was about to leave the package by the door when she heard it. A muffled sound from somewhere around the side of the house, a voice, low and strained, like someone in pain. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to leave the package and go, to mind her own business and get back to her route before she fell further behind schedule. Her supervisor had already warned her twice that month about pacing. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in her chest tightened in a way she couldn't ignore. She walked around the side of the house, past a row of rose bushes just beginning to bloom, until she reached a small side entrance that led into what looked like a private study. The door was ajar. Inside, on the hardwood floor, beside an overturned chair, was a man in his early 50s wearing dress pants and an unbuttoned shirt, gripping his chest with one hand and reaching weakly toward a phone that had slid just out of his reach. Sarah didn't think. She ran inside, dropped to her knees beside him, and grabbed the phone, already dialing 911 before she even registered who he was. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me. Help is coming." The man's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her with a strange mixture of confusion and something like disbelief, as though he couldn't understand why a stranger in a delivery uniform was kneeling over him in his own home. "My pills," he managed to say. "Cabinet, blue bottle." Sarah found the cabinet, found the bottle, and helped him take the medication with shaking hands, while she waited on the line with the dispatcher, describing the address, describing his symptoms, refusing to hang up until she heard sirens in the distance. She kept talking to him the entire time, telling him to focus on her voice, asking him his name even though she suspected he was too disoriented to answer clearly, anything to keep him conscious and present. By the time the paramedics arrived, the man's breathing had steadied, though his face remained ashen. They loaded him onto a stretcher, thanked Sarah for acting quickly, and told her that if she had been even 10 minutes later, the outcome might have been very different. One of the paramedics, a young man with kind eyes, squeezed her shoulder and told her she'd probably just saved a life. It was only after the ambulance pulled away and Sarah stood alone in the driveway trying to process what had just happened that one of the paramedics mentioned the man's name in passing to a police officer who had arrived to file a report. Richard Calloway. Sarah's stomach dropped. Richard Calloway was the founder and CEO of Calloway Freight Solutions, the parent company that owned Blackwood Logistics and nearly a dozen other shipping and warehousing companies across the southeastern United States. He was one of the wealthiest men in Tennessee, a name that appeared in business journals and local news segments, a man whose face Sarah had seen on a poster in the break room exactly once, at the company's annual holiday party 3 years earlier, standing behind a podium giving a speech about growth and opportunity, that Sarah barely remembered because she had been more focused on getting home to relieve the babysitter. She had just saved the life of the man who, without ever knowing her name, controlled every hour of her paycheck. She didn't think much more of it that day. She finished her shift, picked up Emma from school, made dinner, helped with homework, and went to bed exhausted, assuming that would be the end of it. Rich men didn't remember delivery drivers. That was simply how the world worked, at least in her experience of it. She was wrong. 3 days later, a black Cadillac Escalade pulled up outside her apartment building, just as she was leaving for her shift. A driver in a grey suit stepped out and approached her, asking politely if she was Sarah Mitchell. When she confirmed that she was, he told her that Mr. Calloway would like to speak with her, and that a car had been sent to bring her to his office at her convenience. Sarah's first thought was that she was being fired. Perhaps leaving her delivery route to help him had violated some company policy about trespassing on private property. Perhaps he simply wanted to thank her quickly and send her on her way, maybe with a fruit basket, and that would be that. She almost said no, worried about missing her shift and the pay that came with it. But something about the driver's expression, patient and almost apologetic, made her reconsider. She called her supervisor, arranged for someone to cover her route for the day, and got in the car, her hands twisting nervously in her lap the entire ride downtown. The headquarters of Calloway Freight Solutions occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower overlooking the Cumberland River, the kind of building Sarah had driven past 1,000 times without ever imagining she would walk inside. The lobby alone had a fountain in it. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like it took longer than her entire morning route. When the doors opened, she was led down a hallway lined with awards and photographs into a corner office, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. Richard Calloway stood when she entered. He looked tired, paler than she imagined he normally looked, but steady on his feet, dressed in a simple button-down shirt rather than the tailored suits she had seen in his corporate photographs. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you my life." Sarah shook his hand, unsure of what to say. "I just did what anyone would do, sir." "That's not true," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Most people would have left the package at the door. You didn't know me. You had no reason to walk around that house." Sarah sat, folding her hands in her lap, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked in her worn work jacket against the polished mahogany furniture of his office. Richard sat across from her, studying her for a long moment before he spoke again. "Do you know why I was home alone that morning, Miss Mitchell?" She shook her head. "I've had a heart condition for the past 2 years. Something I've kept hidden from my board of directors, from investors, from nearly everyone in this company except my personal physician." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, as though testing how much he could trust her. If word got out that the founder of this company was living with a serious cardiac condition, especially during a year when we're preparing for a major merger, the stock would tank. Investors would panic. The board would move to replace me before I even had a chance to recover. I've built this company from a single delivery truck 30 years ago, back when it was just me and a beat-up Ford and a dream that nobody else believed in. I'm not ready to lose it because of a weak heart. Sarah listened, unsure why he was telling her this. "I understand, sir. "But I don't see what that has to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," he said, "because you're the only person outside my doctor who knows the truth, and I need to know that truth is safe." He explained that he had already looked into her background, an admission that made Sarah stiffen slightly, though he was quick to clarify it wasn't out of suspicion, but necessity. He knew about her divorce, her daughter's asthma, her spotless work record, her 3 years of never missing a shift despite raising a child alone on a delivery driver's salary. He even knew, he admitted a little sheepishly, that she'd once walked 2 miles in the rain rather than call out sick when her car battery died because she couldn't afford to lose a day's pay. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "Personal assistant reporting directly to me. Your responsibilities would include helping manage my schedule, accompanying me to certain appointments, and yes, being aware of my condition so that if something happens again, someone in this building actually knows what to do. The salary would be 4 times what you currently make. Full medical coverage for you and your daughter, and discretion. That's the only thing I'm asking for in return." Sarah sat in stunned silence. It felt too good to be real, the kind of offer that came with strings she couldn't yet see. She thought about asking what would happen if she said no, whether her job at Blackwood Logistics would somehow quietly disappear afterward. But looking at Richard's face, tired and sincere, she didn't sense any threat in it, only a desperate kind of hope. She thought of Emma, of the leaking ceiling, of the nebulizer on the counter and the insulin-adjacent costs that ate into every paycheck, and after a long moment, she said yes. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into another life entirely. Sarah learned the rhythms of Richard Calloway's world, the endless meetings, the international calls at odd hours, the quiet moments when his hand would tremble slightly and he would ask her, without needing to explain, to bring him a glass of water and give him 5 minutes alone. She learned to recognize the subtle signs before anyone else in the room did, the way his voice would tighten, the way he'd shift his weight, and she became skilled at creating small distractions, rescheduling a call, suggesting a break, spilling a folder of papers if she absolutely had to, anything to buy him the time he needed without anyone noticing. In return, Richard kept his word. Emma was enrolled in a better school with a full-time nurse on staff who understood her condition and kept an extra inhaler in the office just in case. Her medical bills were covered in full. For the first time in years, Sarah didn't lie awake at night doing math in her head, trying to figure out which bill could wait another week and which one couldn't. But it was more than the money. Sarah began to see the man behind the name on the building, a man who had built an empire out of nothing, who ate lunch at his desk more often than not, who kept a photograph of his late wife Diane in his top drawer and looked at it every single day at exactly noon before sliding it shut again. He rarely spoke about her, but once, late on a Friday evening when the office had emptied out, he told Sarah that Diane had died 6 years earlier from ovarian cancer, and that the hardest part hadn't been losing her, but losing the version of himself that had existed only when she was in the room. He was demanding, occasionally short-tempered under stress, prone to long silences when a deal fell through, but never cruel. And slowly, without either of them acknowledging it out loud, something like mutual respect grew between them. Sarah found herself defending him without meaning to when other employees grumbled about his high standards. Richard, in turn, began asking her opinion on things far outside her job description, whether a merger felt rushed, whether a new policy would actually help the warehouse workers or just look good on paper. Sarah thought, for the first time in years, that maybe things really were going to get better. Then the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning, delivered not through the mail but slipped under the door of Richard's office sometime overnight. Sarah found it when she arrived for work, a plain white envelope with no return address, containing a single typed page. She almost didn't show it to him, but something about the weight of the paper, the deliberate anonymity of it, the fact that whoever left it had access to the executive floor after hours, told her this wasn't something she could handle on her own. Richard read the letter in silence, his face draining of color as his eyes moved down the page. When he finished, he set it down on his desk and simply stared at the wall for nearly a full minute, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "They know," he finally said. The letter, it turned out, wasn't just about his heart condition. It was about something far more dangerous. It referenced financial records from 4 years earlier, a period during which Richard had personally covered a $2 million shortfall in the company's books, using his own private funds, an act that on its surface seemed almost noble. But the letter alleged that the shortfall hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a bad quarter or a market downturn. It had been deliberately created by someone inside the company, someone close to Richard, in order to trigger an insurance payout on a warehouse fire in Memphis that had killed 2 employees, a man named Carl Jennings and a young worker named Devon Ashworth, who was only 23 at the time. Sarah felt sick reading it. Is this true? Richard rubbed his face with both hands, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked utterly defeated. I've suspected something wasn't right for years. The fire was ruled accidental, faulty wiring. I paid for the funerals of those 2 men out of my own pocket, because the insurance settlement felt like blood money I didn't want to touch with company funds. I visited Carl's widow myself, sat in her living room, apologized for something I didn't even understand yet. But I never had proof anyone did it on purpose, until now apparently someone else does. Who wrote this letter? I don't know, but whoever it is knows enough to end me. If this gets to the board, if this gets to the press, it won't just be about my heart anymore. It'll be about a cover-up that got 2 men killed. Nobody will care that I didn't know. They'll only care that it happened under my name. Sarah sat across from him, her mind racing. Then we find out who's behind it before they find a way to bury you first. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself drawn into something far beyond her job description. Late at night, after Emma had gone to bed, she would sit at her kitchen table with a laptop Richard had given her, cross-referencing old employee records, shipping manifests, and insurance filings from the year of the Memphis fire. She wasn't a trained investigator. She was a delivery driver who had been thrown into the deep end of corporate warfare. But she had something most people in that building didn't have, nothing left to lose, and a fierce, uncomplicated loyalty to a man who had given her daughter a future. It was during one of these late nights that she noticed something odd. The warehouse in Memphis had been managed at the time by a man named Gary Ferris, who had left the company shortly after the fire under what the records vaguely described as mutual agreement. Gary Ferris, according to public property records Sarah found after hours of searching, had purchased a lake house in East Tennessee less than 6 months after his departure, a purchase that seemed wildly out of reach for someone earning a warehouse manager's salary. She found a photo of the property on an old real estate listing. It had a boat dock. She brought this to Richard the next morning, sliding her laptop across his desk. Gary Ferris, Richard repeated slowly, as though testing the name for the first time in years. He worked under my brother-in-law, Thomas Reyes. Thomas ran operations for our southeastern division back then. Sarah felt the pieces sliding into place even before Richard finished speaking. Is Thomas Reyes still with the company? He's on the board of directors, Richard said quietly. He's been pushing hardest for my removal ever since rumors about my health started circulating. I thought it was ambition. I thought it was Thomas finally wanting his own seat at the head of the table after 15 years of standing behind me. The room went silent as the full shape of the conspiracy began to emerge. Thomas Reyes, Richard's own brother-in-law by his late wife's side of the family, had motive, opportunity, and access. If the insurance payout from the fire had been funneled somewhere, if Gary Ferris had been paid to look the other way on faulty wiring inspections in exchange for a comfortable retirement, then Thomas Reyes stood to gain not just money, but eventually control of the entire company, especially now that Richard's health made him vulnerable. We need proof, Sarah said, not suspicion. Proof that would hold up, not just something that makes sense to us. Richard nodded, but his expression was heavy with something that looked almost like grief. Thomas has been part of this family for 15 years. I gave him a seat on the board because Diane asked me to look after him after her sister passed, when Thomas was barely out of business school with nowhere else to go. If this is true, then everything he's done since has been a betrayal, not just of me, but of her memory. Sarah didn't have an answer for that kind of pain. All she could do was keep working. 2 weeks later, everything Sarah and Richard had been quietly building came crashing down before they were ready. Somehow word reached the board that Richard had been investigating internal financial records tied to the Memphis fire. Sarah would later learn that a junior accountant named Melissa Todd, someone she had unknowingly approached for old filing records under the pretense of a routine audit, had mentioned the inquiry to a colleague who happened to report directly to Thomas Reyes. It hadn't been malicious on Melissa's part, just an offhand comment in a break room, the kind of small leak that brings down empires without anyone intending it to. An emergency board meeting was called. Sarah, standing outside the boardroom doors as Richard's assistant, could hear raised voices through the thick oak paneling. Thomas Reyes's voice rising above the rest, calm and calculated in a way that made her skin crawl. When Richard finally stepped out nearly 2 hours later, his face was ashen. "They're moving to suspend me," he said, "pending a formal investigation into my health and my judgment as CEO." Thomas made the motion himself. "He's calling it protecting shareholder interests." He stood up in that room and talked about his concern for my well-being like he actually cared. "That's insane," Sarah said. "He's the one hiding something." "I know that. You know that. But right now all the board sees is a sick, aging founder who's been secretly investigating his own executives without evidence, while rumors about his heart condition finally have a name attached to them." Richard exhaled slowly, sinking into a chair in the hallway, his hands shaking slightly, though this time Sarah suspected it wasn't his heart, but something closer to heartbreak. "By tomorrow, this will be in every business paper in Nashville." The next morning it was. The headline ran across the local business section before spreading to national outlets by afternoon. "Callaway Freight Founder Suspended Amid Health Concerns and Internal Investigation." Sarah watched Richard's face age 10 years overnight as calls flooded in from reporters, from nervous investors, from employees who had built their careers under his leadership and didn't know what to believe. A cable business channel ran a segment with a Chiron reading questions mount over Callaway's judgment, featuring a panel of analysts who had never met Richard speculating about his mental fitness. Sarah too became a target. Someone leaked her name and her background to a business gossip blog eager for a scandal. Within days, articles appeared painting her not as a loyal assistant, but as an opportunist, a former delivery driver who had somehow wormed her way into the confidence of a vulnerable, ailing billionaire. Comment sections filled with cruel speculation. One local news segment even ran a piece questioning what exactly Sarah Mitchell's real role in the Callaway household had been. The implication, clear and humiliating. A Chiron flashing, "The driver who drove herself into a fortune," across the bottom of the screen, while a reporter Sarah had never spoken to speculated about her motives to a studio anchor. At Emma's school pickup line, another parent whispered just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "That's her, the gold digger from the news." Sarah sat in her car afterward and cried for the first time since her divorce, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake ever walking around the side of that house. She thought about quitting. She thought about how much simpler her life had been driving a delivery van, invisible, unremarkable, safe. Nobody wrote cruel articles about delivery drivers. But that night, staring at Emma sleeping peacefully in her bed, oblivious to the storm swirling around her mother, Sarah made a decision. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't going to let a lie define her, and she certainly wasn't going to let it define the man who had trusted her when he had every reason not to. She went back to work. With Richard officially suspended and barred from the building, Sarah became his only remaining connection to the company from the inside. Working quietly, careful not to draw attention, she requested archived security footage from the Memphis warehouse dating back to the weeks before the fire, citing an unrelated compliance audit that gave her just enough cover to access the request without immediately raising alarms. She had learned over the past weeks exactly which forms to file and which names to invoke to make the request look routine. It took 4 days for the footage to arrive, transferred onto an encrypted drive by a records clerk who had no idea what she was actually looking for. Sarah spent an entire night combing through hours of grainy warehouse footage, her eyes burning, coffee going cold beside her laptop, Emma's nightlight glowing faintly from down the hall. At 3:47 in the morning, she found it. Time-stamped footage from 11 days before the fire showed Gary Ferris walking through the warehouse alongside a man Sarah didn't immediately recognize, pointing toward an electrical panel that the fire report had specifically identified as the origin point of the blaze. The two men spoke for several minutes, gestured toward the panel, and walked away without any maintenance crew ever being called, without a single work order filed. Sarah froze the frame and zoomed in on the second man's face. It was Thomas Reyes. Her hands trembled as she saved the footage, made 3 separate backup copies stored in 3 different places, and immediately called Richard, waking him at 4 in the morning. "I found something," she said, her voice barely steady. "You need to see this." By sunrise, Richard had contacted a lawyer he trusted completely, a man named Frank Delgado. Outside the company's usual legal team, who had no ties to the board and owed Richard a decades-old favor from before either of them had any money to speak of. Within 48 hours, the footage, combined with the financial discrepancies Sarah had uncovered weeks earlier, was quietly handed over to federal investigators specializing in corporate fraud, along with a formal request for an independent audit of the insurance payout from the Memphis fire. Thomas Reyes did not go quietly. When rumors reached him that an investigation was underway, he moved fast, using his position on the board to launch a preemptive counterattack. He called a press conference of his own, standing before local reporters with a practiced expression of concern, announcing that in light of irregularities discovered in recent expense reports, the board had also begun looking into Sarah Mitchell's compensation package, hinting publicly that her rapid promotion and salary increase might constitute misuse of company funds by a compromised executive. It was a desperate, calculated strike designed to discredit Sarah before she could testify to anything, and for a few terrifying days, it worked exactly as he hoped. Sarah received a call from an HR representative, informing her she was being placed on administrative leave pending review. She sat in her apartment that evening, staring at Emma's report card on the refrigerator, wondering if she was about to lose everything twice, once through Richard's downfall, and now through her own manufactured scandal. "They can't do this," Richard said when she told him, fury cutting through the exhaustion in his voice for the first time in the entire ordeal. "Thomas is trying to bury the messenger before anyone reads the message." "Then we need to move faster than he can," Sarah said. Frank Delgado worked through the weekend, filing an emergency motion with federal investigators to expedite review of the footage, given the apparent attempt at witness intimidation, a legal term that made Sarah's stomach twist when she first heard it applied to herself. The investigation thankfully moved faster than anyone anticipated. Gary Ferris, faced with federal charges of insurance fraud and falsifying safety records, and shown the footage that placed him unmistakably at the scene, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He confirmed everything. Thomas Reyes had approached him nearly 5 years earlier with a plan to sabotage the outdated electrical system in the Memphis warehouse, framing it as an unavoidable accident that would trigger a substantial insurance payout, a portion of which would be funneled to Ferris in exchange for his silence and his resignation shortly afterward. Thomas had used his position on the board and his family connection to Richard to ensure the internal investigation into the fire never went further than a routine inspection. He had chosen the Memphis facility specifically, Ferris admitted, because it ran the oldest wiring in the company's entire portfolio, meaning the fire would look entirely plausible to any inspector who came looking. 2 men had died because of it. Carl Jennings, who had worked at that warehouse for 11 years and left behind a wife and 3 children. Devon Ashworth, 23 years old, who had only taken the night shift that week to cover for a co-worker's family emergency. When the news broke publicly, it did so with the force of an earthquake. Thomas Reyes was arrested at his home in a quiet suburb of Franklin, Tennessee, led out in handcuffs in full view of television cameras that had only weeks earlier been covering Richard Calloway's suspension and Sarah's supposed misconduct. The same anchors who had speculated about Sarah's motives now found themselves reporting a very different story. The board that had voted to remove Richard now scrambled to distance itself from Thomas Reyes entirely, several members resigning within days rather than face the growing scrutiny of having sat in a room with him for years without asking harder questions. Richard was reinstated as CEO by unanimous vote within a week, the same board that had suspended him now publicly praising his integrity, a reversal so swift it would have been almost comedic if the underlying tragedy hadn't been so real. But for Richard, the victory felt hollow. His wife's nephew, a man he had trusted, had orchestrated the deaths of 2 employees and nearly destroyed the company Richard had spent 30 years building, all to seize control for himself. There was no version of justice that could undo that kind of betrayal. No press release that could give Carl Jennings back to his children or Devon Ashworth back to his mother, who Richard learned had waited 11 years for someone to finally tell her what really happened to her son. The families of the 2 men killed in the Memphis fire were finally given the truth, along with a settlement Richard personally ensured was fair, transparent, and handled with a dignity the original insurance payout had never possessed. He drove to Devon Ashworth's mother's house himself, sat with her at her kitchen table for 2 hours, and answered every question she had been carrying for over a decade. He established a scholarship fund in both men's names for the children they had left behind, quietly, without press coverage, because for the first time in a long while, Richard wasn't interested in headlines. As for Sarah, the same news outlets that had painted her as an opportunist and later as a target of financial misconduct just weeks earlier, now scrambled to reframe her as a hero, running headlines about the delivery driver turned whistleblower who had uncovered a corporate conspiracy. The HR investigation into her compensation was quietly closed within a day, no formal statement issued, no apology given, which stung almost as much as the original accusation had. Sarah found the sudden reversal almost as uncomfortable as the original accusations. She hadn't done any of it for recognition. She had done it because it was right, and because somewhere along the way, Richard Calloway had stopped being just her employer and had become someone she genuinely cared about protecting. She turned down 3 separate interview requests from national morning shows, telling Richard privately that she'd had enough of cameras to last a lifetime. 3 months later, Calloway Freight Solutions held its annual company gathering, the same event where Sarah had once stood in the back of a crowded room watching Richard give a speech she barely remembered. This year, the venue was different, a large hall downtown filled with employees from every level of the company, from warehouse workers to senior executives, all gathered to celebrate the completion of the merger that had once seemed destined to collapse under scandal. Richard stood at the podium, steadier now, his health carefully managed under proper medical supervision that no longer needed to be hidden from anyone, a fact he announced publicly himself, telling the room that he'd learned the hard way that hiding the truth to protect a company was, in the end, no different from the kind of thinking that had let 2 men die in Memphis. He spoke about resilience, about the mistakes the company had made in its past, about the 2 men whose names he read aloud, Carl Jennings and Devon Ashworth, asking the room to observe a moment of silence in their memory. The hall, hundreds of people strong, fell completely silent. Then he asked Sarah to join him on stage. Sarah walked up reluctantly, aware of hundreds of eyes on her, her heart pounding the way it had that very first morning in Richard's office. 3 months ago, Richard said, this company almost lost its way entirely. We almost let fear and greed decide who deserved power and who deserved silence. I almost let a scandal define a woman who had done nothing but the right thing again and again, when it would have been so much easier for her to walk away. One person in this company reminded me what integrity actually looks like, and she didn't do it from a corner office. She did it from behind the wheel of a delivery van, and then she did it again from behind a laptop at her kitchen table at 4 in the morning while her daughter slept down the hall. He turned to Sarah. I'm creating a new division within this company, dedicated to employee protection and internal accountability, reporting directly to the board with full independence, and I can think of no one better to lead it than the person who refused to look away when it would have been so much easier to. The applause that followed was long and genuine, and Sarah, standing at the podium in front of hundreds of people who had once doubted her, felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for years. Somewhere in the crowd, Emma sat beside a company babysitter, waving furiously, grinning with the uncomplicated pride only a 9-year-old could have for her mother. Sarah thought about the version of herself who had walked around the side of that house 3 months earlier, uncertain, exhausted, running on nothing but instinct and a paycheck that barely covered the essentials. She hadn't known that morning that kindness could change the entire direction of a life. She hadn't known that doing the right thing when nobody was watching would someday be witnessed by hundreds, or that it would cost her nearly as much as it gave her before it was over. But she knew it now. And as she stepped down from that stage, her daughter running toward her through the crowd, Sarah realized that everything she had feared losing that morning, her job, her stability, her sense of who she was, had instead become the very things she had finally, truly found. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like Sarah's are only the beginning of what's coming next. Leave a comment below and let us know what part of her journey hit you the hardest, and don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing always matters, even when nobody's watching.